have power against hatred. We have a very interesting program tonight about the impact of trauma in older adults. And importantly, two practitioners will present. Irit Felsen, who you will soon hear from, is an Israeli clinical psychologist and an adjunct lecturer at Yeshiva. And Carla Lessing is a Holocaust survivor and a clinical social worker. I know we will all be interested in what they have to say, and I've asked them to leave time for some questions and answers. And finally, we will have closing remarks from our own Emeriti professor, George Getzel. Oh, there you are. So, audience, let's listen to what they have to tell us about this very important topic. Marie?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the honor of being here today with you. It means a lot to me. This is a very special day. I am a daughter of survivors. This is Yom HaShoah. And like Maria, my parents were amazingly resilient people with many qualities that I admire greatly. And I actually decided that this talk will not be about trauma and old age. That's a different talk. This will be about what we learn from the survivors in terms of both exposure to trauma and resilience. I thought that that was a nice way to come back to the very, very first study that I did as a very young student at the Hebrew University, which I then gave the motto to from the book of Genesis. There is a sentence there, Genesis chapter 6 says, "And the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also after." And the Nephilim translates the closest in English to titans. And I titled my dissertation, which was about Holocaust survivors, I titled it "Our Holocaust Survivor Parents as Titans and as Victims," because I was always so amazed by that complex relationship between that amazing resilience that I saw and the palpable, irreparable, incurable wounds that were very much obvious as well. And I think that there's just so much for us to learn from these amazing people that we come from. So I will now try to speak about as fast as my father read the Haggadah, which is not a small feat to try and accomplish. And I will start by showing you a picture. This picture, for me, represents what I call the dual reality in which survivors and their children live. The Holocaust was such an iconic event that changed the way we think about humankind and human evil for all of us, not just the descendants of survivors. It really is an event that cannot be put in the past. It has changed our view of what is humankind, what lies under the surface, what is the perpetrator within, and as Jacqueline said, how resistant to any kind of reason and other things hatred is, and the fact that it lies there underneath, waiting for the appropriate circumstances, as such game-changing experiments as Milgram's experiment showed, and Ashes and Zimbardo, all experiments that show the so-called banality of evil, if you like, as Hannah Arendt called it, the susceptibility of good people to comply with authority, to comply with role expectations, to be very sensitive to peer pressure and so on, and what that can make us do at times. So the fact that these experiences, these horrific experiences we refer to in the big title Holocaust, happened in the past, is not really in the past for any of us, especially not for the descendants of survivors, but really not for any of us, because it happened in such a civilized place, it happened in such a way that really continues to show us some kind of a hidden potential that can erupt and has erupted in many places since then, unfortunately. So what is the dual reality, as I call it? It's really for survivors and for their descendants, not a cognitive intellectual idea about the presence of human evil and its dangers, but a very experiential feeling of living in two realities. The reality of what is now, what's apparent, you know, the socially acceptable, desirable ways of behaving, what's expected from the other. You know, we're all raising our children to be polite, to be kind, to be helpful, all of these niceties of life under normal circumstances in Canada, in the States, in Israel, in the here and now. And then the reality of the trauma and the traumatic world and the traumatic relationship between self and other, what is then expected from the other, what is then expected from the self when the self is fighting for survival, what are the norms for behavior then. And I'm showing you this picture, which was taken by a friend of mine, also son of survivors, a physics professor, but a very good photographer in my opinion. These are grapevines in the snow in Austria. And I have another one here. You see, when I show it to children of survivors, what they see, and you hear it in the reaction, you hear a gasp, because what they see is inmates in a Holocaust scene in the concentration camp standing in the morning appel. Now, I use this because it is such a good example to show you how the referencing, the internal referencing of a different reality changes the way we respond to a current, very concrete piece of reality that we encounter here. And if that's the way that it impacts how we interpret and what meaning we give to a very simple, concrete, naturalistic photograph of vineyards in the snow, how much more does it interfere with our emotional reaction to much more ambiguous stimuli that have to do with the social, the interpersonal, the political realities around us. Let me give you a small example from yesterday, last night. As I was trying to prepare my notes for the lecture, my daughter came back from a regatta. She participates in the crew club, and very casually she says to me, "Ima, you know, there's a kid," somebody told her on the team that there's a kid on the crew club who tells people that his father was a very high up Nazi. And within a second, for me, the distance between past and present squashed into nothing. For me, all of a sudden, these 60-something years disappeared for a moment, and my reaction was, I had just finished reading Maria's testimony, which I found on the internet at the Museum of the Holocaust, and I read those terrible 100 pages, and in that moment, my daughter was cast into those stories that I just finished reading. It was a terrible moment. And that's how we live. We live in this dual reality where I like to use the metaphor of a glass floor. Imagine that above the glass floor, we live in our here and now reality, and underneath that transparent floor lies the reality of trauma. And it's continuously in view. It's never not in view. It's just that it's sort of, there's an interplay of background and foreground between these two realities, and sometimes this one is in the foreground and sometimes that one is in the foreground, depending on internal triggers, depending on external triggers. For me, yesterday's trigger immediately brought the underworld of trauma to the fore, and I could see, against my wish, I could see my daughter in the stories of Maria. And that is something that happens essentially all the time in the lives of survivors and the lives of their children. We have now a very new thing, which I think is a wonderful thing, and those are the documentaries that survivors and their children are creating, videotaped documentaries of various kinds. And these are a new form of oral public testimony, as opposed to the testimonies that I participated in taking for the Yale Archive, which were wonderful, but were in an archive and very few people got to see. These are available to us as a public, and I will hopefully have a couple of minutes and be able to show you a couple of minutes from one of them at least, and mention a couple of others. So I said I will speak very fast, so let me go to the next thing. For another example of the presence of the past for trauma survivors, I brought you one picture from the so-called Writing on the Wall project by Shimon Ati, an artist who took old pictures from the life of the Jewish people in the Berlin Quarter and projected them on the same buildings, on the ruins of the same buildings. So if there was a Buchhandlung, a bookstore somewhere, he projected the picture on the same building and so forth. Excuse me. And here you see that picture. And what I show you here is because I think art has such a powerful way of communicating what takes so many words for us to explain. It really captures something very profound about human memory in general, and certainly the memory of trauma, how it's there and not there, how a fragment comes and is projected onto the reality of the moment, this old building, out of context, a fragment of memory, and how for trauma survivors, when the memory fragment comes, it's really not there, it's not happening now, but it's so real, it feels so real, its experiential qualities are so compelling. As this picture is real for us when we look at it this way, even though the man is not there. The other thing that it's very much capturing is something from one of the documentaries that I don't think I'll get to show you a section of, is called Never Forget to Lie, by Marian Marzinski. And there is a moment there where one of the survivors who went back to visit Poland and the house in which she lived says, you know, we come and we expect them to still be there. The people, we expect the people. I had the same feeling when I went to my parents' town, but of course they're not there. It's so palpable and it's not there. So let me try to say a couple of words about the response to trauma. The response to trauma is very varied. It differs greatly amongst individuals in populations that are afflicted. So what we see is that a very large number of people exposed to trauma will have post-traumatic reactions. It's still a minority. In most cases, it's still a minority of those exposed, but it can be a large minority. And when I say post-traumatic reactions, I would like very much to stress that I really mean it. I mean post-traumatic reactions in all of their immense variety, and not just post-traumatic stress syndrome, because post-traumatic stress syndrome, while being one of the most well-researched phenomena in terms of post-traumatic reactions, is only one. And what we need to understand and remember is that many, many more people who do not fulfill all of the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder still suffer from many, many symptoms of depression, of anxiety, and partial or subclinical post-traumatic reaction, which is more than enough to cause tremendous suffering for the individual and for their families. So we should not be misled when we look at the numbers that say this many people had post-traumatic reaction after something. Think, yeah, and how many more had subclinical reactions and other reactions. By the way, also not psychiatric reactions, also other reactions, somatic, medical conditions, and many other, of course, in the area of relationships and difficulties living. In fact, one of the things that, one of the good things, I suppose one of the few good things that happened with the new DSM is actually the addition of the criterion lasting cognitions and lasting alterations in cognitions and mood, which attempts to address this element that not only PTSD is the reaction to stress and that we have to be a little bit more sensitive to other aspects, something that many experts in the 90s dealing with Holocaust survivors' claims for restitutions were pointing to, that it's not only the formal definitions of disorders, but also some much more pervasive changes that fall more in the area of personality changes following trauma and suffering and pain that is not exactly limited to a particular formal diagnosis, and that we have to be very aware of that. However, it is still very important to look at the numbers of the disorders that we do utilize in our field. And most important in our field is the fact that we now have meta-analyses of studies. So very sophisticated statistical, mathematical models that allow us to combine the effect sizes of many, many studies and draw some conclusions, because you know, every catastrophe in the end is a case report. It's very difficult to generalize from one catastrophe to another and say, what's worse, if you lost your mother or if you, it's very, very difficult. What's worse, sexual abuse or this or that? We have to be able to somehow pull together a lot of these case reports and try to draw some conclusions from them. So one of these meta-analytical studies was conducted by Fran Norris, and she looked at at 160 samples from 29 countries, different disasters, but all disasters involving mass disasters, not individually perpetrated violence. And this is what she saw, just kind of a quick thing, look at it. 77% of the samples had specific psychological disorders that were strong enough to fulfill criteria for diagnosis. 68 of them was PTSD, 36% depression, 20% anxiety disorders that are not PTSD. Other non-specific psychological distress, or so-called caseness, in almost 40% of the samples, health problems that are not psychiatric in 23, and so forth. Problems in living, including problems in relationships, difficulty sleeping, difficulty functioning in 10%. Resource loss is very important. It pertains not only to the loss of actual services in the community, it also pertains to one's own sense of having lost one's embeddedness in their social environment. And that is seen sometimes not only in people where the services are lost or they were displaced to another place, but even in communities that were afflicted who remain in their own place. Something happens to one's sense of embeddedness and one's sense of connection. For child survivors, let me see, excuse me, when do I have to stop, Jackie?
Well, I'm so engrossed, I wasn't looking at the time.
Yeah, but, however,
15 minutes.
15 minutes. Okay, we'll do very quickly. I'm sure my father's proud of me, but, okay. So, so we looked at some of those things. Now, with regards to children, child survivors, children who are exposed to traumatic events, it's a little bit different than adult survivors. For adult survivors, the problem is often the intrusion of fragments of memories and so forth. For child survivors, it's often the opposite. It's the lack of memories. It's the lack of knowing who they were and who their parents were and what were they actually before the trauma and what was life before that and what were their traditions. It's the absence that is so destructive for a sense of self and a sense of identity and a sense of sort of a coherent self-narrative. And so I wanted to show you here, if I may, 2 minutes. here. These are people who went back, two brothers.
I'm looking for my real name. חייב להיות רשום איך נולדתי, איפה נולדתי, מתי.
כי שמעת צעקות ואת היריות שהיו בחוץ. למחרת מוציאים אותנו מפה, ואז התברר שלא נשאר אף אחד. אמא השביעה אותה, תשמרי על הילדים.
תוך כדי נסיעה היא רצה ושמה ילד. תוך כדי רצה היא שמה ושמה עוד ילד. היא לא ידעה אם זה לחיים או למוות, אבל היא נקראה מאיתנו.
אני זוכר את הריח שלה, אני זוכר את ריח הגוף שלה.
פתחתי את העיניים בבוקר, תמיד היה חיבוק, החיוך הזה. טוב לא היה אף אחד. זיכרונות הילדות מתחילים למעשה בתקופה הזאת פה. הפסי רכבת, הרכבות, הפסי רכבת. לא יודע איך אתה חי את כל העשרות שנים האלה. וזה שוכב לך פה, שוכב לך פה.
מתי אני החזקתי ככה את היד?
זה בחיים. אני לא זוכר אותך.
לא, רק כשילדים רצתי איתך לשדה שם, שהגיעו הנאצים עם האופנועים, עם הכלבים, רק ככה תפסתי אותך ורצתי איתך.
לא, אבל נראו של ילדים בני שנתיים. המשחק שלנו היה ריצה בין בונקר לבונקר, זה היה המשחק.
תן תנופה, אל תתבייש, ככה. נכון, זה כיף להיות ילד? כל דבר להיות כמו בלב שנרתון עוד רק בו.
These are two brothers, one of whom was too little to remember, and one was older and is the one who writes his memories for the family. The younger one, at other parts of the movie, you can see, is actually trying to construct for himself a narrative whereby he must have thought that what was happening at the time was some sort of a game because he was too young to understand, which is what was often told to child survivors and is often told to child survivors of terrible things. You were too young to understand and therefore you were protected by your lack of comprehension of the horrors. A little bit like the premise of the movie Life is Beautiful, which I can't stand. Really, studies show that that is not a supportable view. Little children do get very clearly the fear, the frightening behaviors and the frightened behaviors of their parents. It was shown by ample studies. If we had a little bit more time, or if you feel like it, go look on YouTube at something called the still face experiment, and it will show you how a very young infant totally gets when the mother changes her affect and is not responsive because she's afraid or she's depressed. Children do get it, and child survivors, in fact, are different from Holocaust adult survivors in the way that they deal with stress in their later life. It was shown that they're more vulnerable to it, they suffer more dissociative reactions in everyday life, and many other things that are consistent with that. When the adult, by the way, recently in 2014, a study came out by the World Health Organization. They conducted an enormous survey of mental health in many countries, and the study that I'm talking about looked at PTSD specifically. And what the results showed was that for people who have PTSD, people who have the symptoms that conform with the diagnosis of PTSD in the last year, when you look at those who had suffered in their lives more than 4 traumatic events, they have a much more complex, much more robust, much more treatment resistant, much longer duration PTSD than other people. That's with 4 traumatic events. People who suffer, children who were exposed to genocide, suffer many more than 4 events during that time, and so are likely to have a much more complicated post-traumatic reaction. When adults suffer exposure to trauma and following that develop post-traumatic reactions, we have to remember that the other people living with that adult are also exposed to the risk of secondary traumatization, as we call it. And we see it very, very clearly now in returning veterans, currently returning veterans. When the parent, when the father has PTSD, the spouse develops very, very often, in very high percentages, symptoms of PTSD resembling those of the father, whether because it's very difficult to live with that man, whether because it's a very stressful situation in and of itself, or because of identification with them. But there is a very strong correlation in PTS, post-traumatic symptoms, between spouses, and there is a very strong correlation between the conflict and dissatisfaction and post-traumatic symptoms in the parents and psychopathology in the children. So we're looking right now not only at children who were exposed, and a lot of children were exposed to all kinds of political violence and genocide in the 20th century, and they're growing older soon, so that is now becoming something we have to be aware of as a huge public health problem. These people will have PTSD because one of the things that releases or triggers late PTSD is a lot of the issues that are related with normative processes of aging, and hopefully I'll have a minute to speak about that, and also the biological processes that are involved in impaired cognition. So dementia is both, it's a bidirectional relationship with PTSD. We think that PTSD, there's many studies suggesting that PTSD is related to premature aging and to brain aging and to damage in many neurological processes leading perhaps to early dementia, and that dementia in itself releases and triggers PTSD symptoms because they might have been warded off before and defended against, and now the person can no longer do that. Even in people who are not suffering from any kind of cognitive impairment, the natural processes of aging are such that when people are older, we're all going to, I think it actually starts somewhere after 50, maybe, as my professor Shannon used to say, once you realize that you have less time to live than you've lived already, it becomes something that you begin to reminisce, you begin to review things, you begin to think about life, you begin to work towards what Erickson called, self-integration. And if you don't manage to do that, the danger is that you'll fall into despair. Well, it's very difficult to make peace with such traumatic events as genocide. It's very difficult to make meaning of it. It's very difficult to accept that that was the path that brought you where you are. And that's part of the injury of children of survivors dealing with their parents' pain, because yes, we wouldn't have been here had it not been for the Holocaust, many of us, because our parents got together somehow because of this and through this, but we're not good enough to make up for that. We're good, we're important, we're the apple of their eye, we're the most important thing that could be, but we can't make that be okay, that all of that was lost and now they have us. It just isn't possible to do that. So talking about child survivors who were exposed, we understand that they're at risk for late onset PTSD, and we've seen it now in many populations. We also think that that's related to real biological processes that occur in the brain, that the need to be on guard all the time as a very young child does introduce dysfunction of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and that is something that remains with them for the rest of their lives. We see now in the last couple of years studies that come out about adults who are children during World War II, not Jewish children, and we see in them also tremendous evidence for the deleterious impact of a childhood in times of war. Finnish children who were evacuated to Denmark and to Sweden show about 20% more severe PTSD symptoms than those who were not evacuated from their homes. English children who were evacuated show a much higher likelihood of having insecure attachment and lower ratings of well-being than children who were not evacuated. German children who suffered either dislocation or even those who don't. There are several studies that look at them, and they have much higher rates of PTSD than other children. So that is, of course, true also for the Jewish child survivors. And there's a whole group of articles by Amir and Lev Wiesel from Israel that show what I mentioned before, much less good reaction to stress later in life, much less good feeling about life in general, despite very successful lives, a bleaker perspective, and feeling that life stresses are more stressful than other people the same age who are not children during the Holocaust. Let me see, when am I stopping?
In about 3 minutes.
In about 3 minutes, okay. So let me quickly go to the evidence for resilience, because I promised that that would be the other part. So here is a meta-analysis of many, I think 71 studies about Holocaust survivors, children and adults. And what you see is actually in great bars on paper the evidence for the fact that they did not differ from others in many measures of adaptation. And the two very tall bars there, they represent post-traumatic symptoms. So that's where they differ. They have a lot of post-traumatic stress symptoms, and we see it in many different studies, 50, 60, now almost 70 years after the fact, but a great deal of adaptation and creativity and productivity that coexisted with that. I want to show you a couple of pictures. Look at that. These are grills from an old oven and bells that are hung on them in the room of a Holocaust survivor, the father of Kathy Tal, who has this picture in her book. And this is a camera hidden inside fake leaves put up there in the ceiling in the house of another Holocaust survivor, parent of a patient of mine. These are people with very developed paranoid delusions, and yet highly functional and very productive throughout their lives. It's just that they think that someone is trying to kill them. And that's something that would define them to the unknowing psychiatrist or psychologist as paranoid delusional. So the coexistence of these things, this we will not do. And so I wanted to speak about the fact that the studies show us that we really need to change our concept of resilience. Resilience is not an all or none thing, and resilience is a much more complicated transactional process. It's not a trait that the individual has or doesn't have. It's not even about a coping mechanism or a coping style, as we afterwards try to look for. It is truly more of a transactional process that occurs between the individual and their environment. And that's where we come in as professionals and as advocates to make sure that we create such environments where people who come out with experience of trauma have an easier access to that which makes that environment supportive and enhancing of growth, of strengths, and of resilience. Since I only have a couple of minutes, I will go to the most important point that I wanted to say. This is, by the way, these are two pictures that were painted by someone that I discovered in my mother's Shiva, was actually related to me by marriage in a roundabout Jewish way. You know, everybody's about 2 degrees of separations from the other. He's a very, very well-known children's painter. I brought a couple of his books to show you. He painted all his life only children's books, never addressed the fact that he was a child survivor of the Holocaust. In fact, he used to brag, I heard afterwards, that he's the most popular painter in Israel because every Israeli carried his artwork with him, since he was the one who designed the bills of our money. And only when he was very old, at the end of his life, he created 6 paintings that he called 6 paintings for 6 millions. And these are 2 of them, this one and that one. And what I wanted to finish with, since we really have to be brief, and hopefully this is just the beginning of a good conversation in which we can continue to talk about some of the things, what I wanted to say was that with regards to resilience, everything I know about resilience and everything I read about, I already learned from my parents and from their friends and from Maria Rosenbloom and from these people and how they lived. They invented it in the way that they acted. And if I needed to come up with these ideas, all I need to do is ask myself, what did my parents and their friends do? And what they did was they created for themselves and for one another the opportunities to be better parents. They were non-judgmental. They accepted each other with their stories, with awful things that happened there, supported each other in normalizing it, in becoming normal again despite that, and helped each other in concrete, psychological, emotional, and all other ways. This multi-level intervention that we need to offer to trauma survivors. They supported each other essentially in their parental and spousal functioning, which is so protective for the children, which is why we came out not so bad, the second generation. And they created for themselves and for us a lot of opportunities to connect, to create this group of very close-knit relationships that understood and supported each other, and that created a lot of opportunities for creativity, for fun, around games, around art, around sports, which is what we're now trying to create in afflicted populations as an intervention, not just psychological mental health interventions, but actually interventions that help people reconnect within the family and within their communities around growth-promoting activities, because we know that the relationship between post-traumatic symptoms and post-traumatic growth is a very complicated relationship. To some extent, these processes are parallel in the sense that we see more post-traumatic growth where there is more post-traumatic stress. It's like the stress of it pushes people to find new ways to cope and better ways to cope. But we also see that post-traumatic growth is greater where there is more affluence in communities that are more affluent, because they have more opportunities for growth-promoting activities that help people feel better. What we have to remember is what Zahava Salomon wrote about in her beautiful article titled, "Why Are Lessons Learned and Forgotten?" It's about the very bad history of our profession in learning very important lessons about post-traumatic stuff and about trauma and the impact of trauma, and promptly forgetting them. We have to understand that these lessons came to us at a very high price. And we, as mental health professionals, have to be the ones advocating not just for our patient in our room, but also in our communities, so that these lessons are implemented for those who need it, not only in the therapy session, but also otherwise. And it is our responsibility, because we are the ones who see these wounds from very close. It's our responsibility to hold these lessons in the utmost fidelity and make sure that they're not forgotten again, so that the people who come out of the current traumas are those who really met with human evil, eye to eye, will not be met with our own human frailty in the face of their suffering. Thank you very much.